It's time to admit that Milton Friedman was wrong. We got to admit this. That does not mean Keynes is right. It means both Friedman, the monetarist, and the Keynesiast are both wrong. So we have to look for a third way, because this is insanity, man. It's insanity that we keep perpetuating both these myths. Stephanie Kelton and the group, Gary Moser or something like that, the MMT, those people are wrong. You have the Austrians, hell, their Bastiat allegiance, Frederick, I love Bastiat, but free trade is wrong 100%. And the monetarists, I'm going to prove the monetarists wrong again, because it's frustrating we don't know when. And before you say, oh, you must be a liberal. No, I'm a big fan of Milton Friedman. I have this, a different version, signed by Milton and Rose. Even if you look at the history of monetary history, I don't have a signed copy of that, but I do have it. I wish I would have had that signed by him and Anna Schwartz. And basically, Milton Friedman's book, let's see what that camera was called. Yeah, and this is the book I don't know if I have this one anymore now, but I used to have this exact one. This is literally the Bible of modern economic theory. Like you can argue with Michael Hudson all day long, how he thinks Chicago school runs control over everything. I don't agree with that, but in some regard, he's right. This is what everyone and their mom, from Helicopter Ben Bernanke to Greenspan to Paul Volcker to Brian Westbury, they all follow this monetary history of the United States. And this literally has set off the point. And basically, monetarism is the thought process was the Great Depression was caused by a contraction in the money supply, the M2 essentially. And if there is a contraction in the monetary supply that led to the depression, then inherently the solving of that would be an expansion of the monetary supply to nip any future depressions, i.e. 2007, 8, and 9, which is Helicopter Ben. He's going to drop money on the economy to make sure we don't go into depression. And just like the jabs, when people say, yeah, I got COVID for the 80th time and I went to the hospital, but it could have been worse if I wasn't jabbed. It's the same thing here. It's like, oh man, thankfully we followed Helicopter Ben Bernanke, because if we didn't, the Great Recession would have been a lot worse. And you can't validate that. You can't disprove that. So you're like, okay, you just don't know, because you're trying to prove a negative. Anyway, so this is the Bible of the monetary economics right now, and it's and a lot of people follow this. Larry Summers does. It's crazy. But anyway, I was reading this from Brian Westbury, who's a huge monetarist, and I said, "Whoa, Westbury, what's?" I think we're getting to him. I think we're starting to, but he's still got a ways to go. It's kind of like my man Michael Edison. I love Michael Edison. I would consider him a friend. He's a brilliant guy, way smarter than I am, it will ever be. But he was wrong when it came to his climate change stuff. He had a wonderful skeptical eye of Wall Street shenanigans, but he completely bought hook on his sinker the climate change, the scam, the ClimateGate scam. He said, no, they would never lie. And I said, Michael, you're so skeptical of Wall Street, money making machine, but yet you're totally turning a blind eye to climate change people, because they're doing the same thing. Why would they lie? To get money and power. It's just that simple. Anyway, he's kind of come around. He's still a pretty green advocate on renewables. I'm not, but he's coming around. I think Westbury is starting to as well. All right. So anyway, we're going to talk about Westbury right here. What do I want to talk about? Right. Even though everyone talks about the interest rates, it is the real money supply growth that matters. We follow M2 because that's what Milton Friedman told us to do. M2 is a currency in circulation, which includes time deposit accounts, checking accounts, those called demand deposit accounts, savings, all the deposits in banks. So Westbury goes on and says, if M2 increases by 10%, we would expect a 10% increase in overall spending. We wouldn't. Some of that would be soaked up by real increases in output, but the rest would be going to inflation. And then he talks about how M2 grew at an 18% annual rate, and no wonder inflation has climbed to 9%. Raising interest rates by itself will not stop inflation. Hey, I think that's a win for the good guys, because that's what we've been saying. I think Westbury probably a little bit new to this, but in terms of that, because he's been talking about the Fed needing to do things, mostly interest rates, but now he's talking M2, which is cool. I'm getting that. Maybe I missed it, but this is a win. But however, the way to stop is not to raise interest rates, but to slow the growth in M2 to a low enough rate to allow the economy to absorb the excess money, which is exactly what happened to Volcker in the 1980s under Volcker. when he altered the focus of the Fed towards money and not interest rates. And I'm gonna read this because it's so we can easily. I was going to bed last night, and I always read a couple blog posts. And I read my fiction books at night. So I read my nonfiction books. Here's Ayn Rand, by the way. Oh, just a side note. Did you know Alan Greenspan was an acolyte of Ayn Rand? And you know Ayn Rand did not believe in God. She was an atheist. I actually do think she believed in God. I think she just hated God, frankly. She calls herself an atheist that she doesn't believe, but I think most atheists just have a profound hatred of God. So Greenspan and others turn their eyes to Ayn Rand. I like Ayn Rand, but they're anti-God, objectivist. The money is a god for a lot of these people on the right. And you see tons of atheists on the right, tons. It's actually pretty interesting because they bought hook, line, sinker, the Ayn Rand models. All right, so I'm reading this in my thing last night before I'm going to bed, and I'm reading this Westbury thing. I said, "Oh, I think he's getting it." And I said, "No, Westbury, you're wrong. I can't believe this." All right, so I was just chuckling because I said, "Oh man, I'm going to debunk this easily because it's easy to do." Prior to 1970s, to Volcker in 1970s, the Fed would talk about what level the Fed funds rate it was aiming for, and people started to believe it was the level of rates that mattered. But this was never the case. All right, welcome to the party, buddy. The Fed consistently held rates lower than a free market and a level of inflation suggested it should. Did they now, Brian Westbury? Did they? Let's take a gander, shall we? So here's the Fed funds rate. Here we are in 1960 right there. 1969 at 9.5%. That's consistently below what it should have been. Well, what is inflation in 1969? Let's take a gander. Inflation was 5.5. Interesting. So inherently that is not being held lower. It's not being suppressed lower than what inflation should be. Here's 1974, 12.17. 12.17. What was inflation in 1974? 11%, again, not below inflation, all right? Oh, by the way, here's inflation. From 1974 to 1976, it basically went down by almost half. Interesting. What did the Fed funds rate do? Went down by a little bit more than half. So no wonder why they reduced the Fed funds rate, because inflation was being reduced. Oh, never mind the oil. I'm not going to talk about OPEC, because, no one wants to talk about energy. We all want to talk about the Fed, which is silly. So why would you think this is being suppressed when inflation is dropping? Oh, by the way, when did Volcker take over in this chair of the Federal Reserve? 1979. Volcker didn't care about the Fed funds rate? Here we are in 1980. Literally months after he took over, and it went, literally, here's 79. Right there. January 1st, 79, 9.94. 13, literally 1980, 18.3, even up to 20% under Volcker. But again, the Fed consistently held rates lower than a free market warranted it should. Paul Volcker turned that on the head. He understood because of Friedman that it's money supply growth that mattered. So this is what I want to focus on, money supply growth that mattered. So he targeted money growth and let interest rates go wherever they may. You're telling me Paul Volcker had no say in this? He just said, yeah, whatever, dudes. No, of course come on, Brian. Some people believe he tightened money too much and that the interest rate spiking well above inflation, close to 20%. This might have been the case. Okay. But this is all why inflation because he kept money growth, I'm adding, because that's what he said before, tight until it was observed and it was tamed. So I want to show you guys something. This is just freaking, I'm just like, dude, I'm just a guy in my freaking t-shirt with my dogs and a little pad of paper. That's it. So we're going to go to money supply growth. So growth in the monetary supply, according to Brian Westbury and Milton Friedman, because that's what he talked to us, is how you taper, you deal with, you tame inflation. All right. So in 1975 to 1976, the monetary supply grew by 13%. From 1976 to 1977, it grew by 10%. From 1977 to 1978, it grew by 7.6. From 1978 to 1979, it grew by 7.8. So basically, the 4 years previous to Volcker, the monetary supply growth was basically almost halved. It went from 13% all the way down to 7.6%. Not quite half, but basically the monetary supply growth was almost halved. Volcker takes over. It goes from 1979, 7.8% to 8.5 to 9.7. So the growth in the M2, this is M2 by the way, the growth in M2 went up 180, went from almost 9.7 minus 7.8 divided by 7.8. It went up almost 9.7 minus 7.8 divided by 7.8. It went up 24% in those 2 years, from 1979 to 1980, from 1979 to 1981. And then by the end of 1983, it was at 11.4. So basically from 1979, the M2 growth went from 7.8 to 11.4 in 1983 under Volcker. So where do we, I mean, and you can see the chart here. This is logged. We don't have to log it. What you're saying, I'm trying to find where the Titan was, right there? That tiny little thing of slowing monetary growth, that's what stopped inflation right there? I mean, come on, Brian. What's this right here? Oh, that's the increase on M2 growth. This is silly. I just don't understand this, man. Let's see. He kept monetary growth tight, because that's what he said. It was money supply growth that mattered. It was slower money supply growth, not higher interest rates that stopped inflation. I just proved it to you, and you can look at it yourself, and you don't have to log this. I just like logging it because I think it looks cool. It makes me sound smart. So we're going to unlog it here, and you'll just see. There's no one can make an argument that monetary supply wasn't growing steadily under Volcker. It grew faster under Volcker than the 4 years previous under, I think it was Burns. All right, let's keep looking here. Let's see. So why do we have to learn this again? Well, part of the answer is that the Fed shifted from a scarce reserve policy to an abundant reserve policy, and that's what started QE, quantitative easing. It basically increased the amount of money that were in the reserves, the bank reserves. And this is what I did my video on the other day. There's tons and tons and tons of money just sloshing around the bank reserves, but it's not making its way into the economy. If it's not making its way in the economy, it doesn't mean squat in the banks. It doesn't mean squat. It doesn't. It doesn't have anything to do with inflation. All right, so he will argue against this a little bit. The reason this works is because the banks had few, if any, excess reserves. Everything they got, they lent out. All right, so let's keep looking here because he calls it the money multiplier. So back in at the end of 2007, the banks had $850 billion in reserves. But the M2 money supply was $8 trillion. So basically, the money multiplier was 9 to 1. So basically, for every $9 in the economy, you had 1 in bank reserves. But all changed in 2008, where now we got the Fed's balance sheet is $9 trillion, but M2 growth has gone to $22 trillion. So now the banks only have 2.5 of M2 per $1 reserves, not 9. The money multiplier has collapsed. We have excess reserves. Yeah. No crap. We have excess reserves that aren't making its way in the economy. The Fed has grown tremendously relative to the economy and the banking system. All right, so hold on just a second. So he's arguing that that the Fed has too much. There's too much reserves out there. The Fed's got too big of a balance sheet. So how do we reverse this? All right, once the Fed allows M2 to be created, it can't destroy it. All those deposits are owned by someone, you, me, your employer, or the Treasury. Well, but they might be owned by the Treasury, but they're literally sitting in the bank, just sitting there. The Fed can't take them away. They're private property. There are only 3 ways to limit monetary supply growth under the abundant reserve model. First, paying banks interest on the reserves at a high enough rates to keep them from lending. But that drives me up the wall. But this approach means that at 3.5%, the Fed would be paying private banks roughly $120 billion per year. This may or may not stop them from lending, but it'll certainly not make politicians happy. How do people not do this? To lend, you have to have a borrower. If there's no borrower, you can't lend, dude. I don't. Oh, it's so doggone frustrating. I know no one's gonna watch this video. None of these videos get very high watch. I don't care. It's my efforts at posterity to show people stop. Anyway, second, the Fed can raise capital requirements. What does capital requirements sound like? Oh yeah, reserve requirements. They just changed the name essentially. Even Brian Westbury talks about this a little bit. He used to say they used to use reserve requirements, but now they use capital requirements, which is basically the same thing. So they can increase capital requirements or reserve requirements. Now they're increasing capital requirements. It's the same. Again, you're skinning the same cat here. You're saying, okay, last week JP Morgan was forced to raise his Tier 1 capital ratio to 12.5 from 11.2. And Jamie Dimon said these rules are capricious and arbitrary. He's correct. They have nothing to do with the banks themselves and everything to do with slowing the monetary supply. The third way has little to do with the Fed. If the Treasury ran a surplus like it did in April, it could reduce its debt and allow the Fed to allow the bonds to mature. But this is unlikely to last. The U.S. has what appears to be a permanent budget deficit. Yeah. So what was the reason? I want to say, I want to go back to Reagan, because what he says is interesting. It was slower money supply growth, not higher rates that stopped inflation. At the same time, Reagan cut regulations, tax rates, and slowed government spending. This let real economic output accelerate and also help absorb some of the excess money of the 70s. So first of all, let's take a look, shall we? I want to show you something here. This is a national debt. Notice under Carter actually went down. What causes an increase in debt? It's deficit spending. So they're saying Paul Volcker was slowing down M2, but that's the monetary side, but the fiscal side with tax cuts and excess borrowing was spending it all. So Volcker might have been slowing down M2, but the money was being gobbled up in the economy with deficits and tax cuts. And you can see this is the total debt. A debt is just the increase in deficits, the additional deficits. That's it, man. And you can see it's pretty flat, and then whoops, and under Bush. And here's a Republican Congress right here, and here's under Obama. But come on, Brian. And here's the deficit spending. You can see starting under Nixon, it hit, then it'll slow down, then it hit again under Reagan. And then under Clinton, we had some surpluses because of the Republican Congress. Under Bush, deficits, where Cheney said, if Cheney or Rumsfeld, one of these guys, or Newt Gingrich, we can grow our way out of deficits, basically by increasing economic output, which Reagan was able to get done because of deregulation. Reagan cut regulations and tax rates. Well, you know who started cutting regulations? It wasn't Reagan, it was Carter, man. I mean, look, as much as I can't stand Carter, we're too falling in on this false dichotomy of red versus blue. Reagan good, Carter bad. Carter is the one who started the deregulations. Anyone on the left will tell you that, who's a true follower of the left. You know, trucking, airlines, the stock commissions, the whole thing. Carter was actually the one who said we got to stop natural gas, and we started doing this clean coal stuff. It was Carter, because we're running low on natural gas. We thought we were going to run out. Oh, it turns out we had tons of natural gas via fracking. No one knew that until George Mitchell in the mid-2000s. But that's why we went to coal to begin with, because it looked like we're running out of natural gas. Anyway, the point being is what caused the economic output to fall off a cliff, i.e. relative to inflation, in the 70s was just simply energy pricing, man. Well, Vietnam War, I get you, that was spending, but it was just energy, without question. I mean, you can't have high expensive energy and not high inflation. You're not going to have that. Ultimately, you have no inflation. It'll be so high, it'll be scarcity, which is why the CPI did not include appliances and new cars in their CPI models during World War II, because there were none available. So inherently, inflation was infinite at that point because there was none available. No new cars, no new household appliances. Thus, they were removed from CPI because they're so scarce that there's an infinite inflation amount. They said, we're not going to use this. Anyway, the point being, my friends, let me show you something here. In fact, Brian even said about reserve requirements. I forgot about this. Reserve requirements have been replaced by direct regulation on how much capital a bank must hold. So it's the same thing. I mean, it's literally, you got to keep so much liquid in your vaults, essentially, that you can't lend out. But here's the problem. This is why the QE did not create inflation. The Fed grew its balance sheet, but it also increased the capital requirements, which kept the banks from multiplying those new reserves by lending it out. But again, I don't get why these people keep overlooking the fact it's like a stock trade. I'm selling my stock. You have to have a buyer. There's two sides to a borrower-lender relationship. You have to have the lender, the banks, who would love to lend it out and return net interest income. And you have to have a borrower. If you don't have a borrower, you don't have a lender. So this is the issue. He's saying, oh no, it's capital requirements is what kept inflation from happening in 2008 to 2014, i.e. all the money the Fed had created did not find its way into the economy. Well, it's the same thing now because there's no borrowers. And and I don't know if Brian or one of his guys on his teams watches my thing here. I'm sure he does not, but I find it ironic that he talks about velocity of money because I just did a video on that. Some people say the velocity of money is falling, that we don't need to worry about M2 as much. Slower velocity will help get inflation back down and keep it there. And then he goes on to say it's an odd. This is odd. Slower velocity means every dollar boosts economic activity by less than it used to, 100%. In fact, if we have velocity under 1, that means for every dollar basically printed, essentially, actually declines economic output. So if you have a velocity of 2, that means for every dollar printed, you have $2 increase in economic output. I hope that makes sense. If you have a velocity of 1.1, that means for every dollar increase printed, you have a 10-cent increase, literally 10%, a dime increase in economic output. Historically, we've had well above 2, and we've been dropping for a long time, since 1997. Slower velocity, okay, but this is a feature of the abundant reserve model, but that doesn't make sense because the velocity of money was dropping like a brick in water well before the QEs of 2008, in 1997. Look it up, as Warner Wolf used to say, until he got dementia and became an ass clown. This is a feature of the abundant reserve model. Again, abundant reserves is that you don't have scarcity in the bank reserve supply. You have tons and tons of money just sitting there because the Fed balance sheet is so high. Okay, but then how do you? Just the whole thing is this argument is just odd. As the Fed grows its balance sheet, bank balance sheets grow as well, but the money is not allowed to circulate because higher and higher capital requirements. This is why velocity has fallen. That's simply not true. But velocity has fallen because people aren't borrowing. Literally, it's just that simple. I don't know why these guys have to overlook the simple. Simplicity is divine, my friends. Velocity itself has not changed. Money has. Velocity itself literally has changed. The thing that worries us most is the Fed will keep growing its balance sheet and government's power by regulating banks, which brings us back to Volcker and Reagan by slowing the growth of money, which we just proved he did not. He did not slow the growth of money, at least in M2, and he did not. Volcker took the Fed out of the business of juicing the economy by cutting tax rates and reducing regulations. Reagan revived the private sector. I'm done. The monetarist school is dead. The Keynesian school is dead. The Austrian school is dead of free trade. We need an Austrian nationalistic school of entrepreneurship. That's what we need. Entrepreneurship, you're going to pay a little bit when you don't have cheap labor from China and Vietnam and stuff. But you got to be able to have smaller communities. Buy local, man. I completely agree. Buy local to the best of your ability. Pay a little bit more for localized entrepreneurship. Main Street, not Wall Street. Main Street. Yes, it will be more expensive, but it'll be a hell of a lot more sustainable than the last 40 years, which is now coming to it's over. The last 40 years are over. The experiment was great while it lasted. Those days are gone now. The Keynesian experiment was great while that lasted. Those days are gone too. A third wave is what we need. Nationalistic Austrian, without the free trade overseas. Free trade internally, not externally. Love your thoughts. We'll see you